What he's now doing, he just announced that if you want to pay extra, you can get those posts a little bit sooner than everybody else. What is the purpose of that? Why would you need a post 10 or 20 seconds before everybody else gets to see it? I'm not really sure the time lag, but it's something very small. Who would care? The only person who would care is a trader who's got like a program, an algorithm, where he can program Trump's Truth Social account directly into the algorithm to immediately trade based on those posts. So Donald Trump is saying, if you want basically what amounts to insider information, market moving information, I'll share it with you early if you pay me money. He's basically selling access to this information so you can trade off of it before anybody else gets it. How is there not outrage over what Trump is doing? Because it's actually an admission, too, that his posts can move the market, because that's the only added value. I mean, why else would you pay? Oh, these posts are so important, I need to pay extra to get them 10 seconds earlier or 20 seconds earlier. Who cares? Except if you get them 10 or 20 seconds earlier, you can position yourself in the markets before everybody else.
The Peter Schiff Show.
I'm going to start off today's podcast by wrapping up some of the action in the markets this week. I speculated in prior podcasts recently that the air may be coming out of the AI bubble. And we certainly got some more indication this week that that was in fact the case, because the major stock markets all finished the week lower, led lower by AI-related names. They were some of the biggest losers. In fact, SpaceX, a stock that I talked about quite a bit on the last couple of podcasts, was one of the biggest losers. It was down about 5.5% today. And on the week now, SpaceX dropped 13.25%. It closed just below 124. The IPO price was 135. So even if you bought the IPO, you're down 6.7% if you didn't flip it, which obviously some people did, but pretty much everybody is now down. And in fact, if you bought the high, because 2 or 3 days after the 135 IPO, SpaceX actually topped 225. If you bought that price, you're down 45% if you still hold your shares. And to me, again, this is indicative that the speculative froth is coming off the market, that people don't want to keep gambling on SpaceX. And I talked at length about the crazy valuation, not just the $1 trillion plus market cap or whatever it was, 2-3 trillion, but the fact that it was trading at more than 100 times revenues and losing money. And people are now getting nervous. And I pointed out that this is all happening with a tiny float. The float now is about 5% after the green shoe got exercised by the underwriters based on the initial demand for the stock. So that enabled the green shoe, where the underwriters can oversell it and then get extra stock to cover their shorts. So you have about 5% of the total company tradable. Elon Musk owns better than 40% personally, and his shares are locked up, I think, well into 2027. So his shares are not in the market. But between now and the end of the year, a lot of other employee-owned early investor shares become free trading. So between now and the end of this year, which is not that very long, we're going to go from a 5% of the shares available to be sold to 40%. An eightfold increase in the supply of stock. That is a lot of overhang. A lot of people are already shorting SpaceX right now. Short interest is exploding. Now, I think that a lot of the shorts could be the people that own these shares that are currently locked up. What they may be doing is just shorting the stock now, and they'll cover when their shares are free trading. So they don't have any risk. If the stock goes up, well, they just get the current price, which they're happy to get because they got their shares, for nothing if they're employees. They just got issued stock. But it shows you a lot of people don't have the confidence to wait out the lockdown or lockup. They're selling now. They don't want to take their chances on where the stock price might be. So the sentiment is turning. Because remember, a lot of the hype that was built into SpaceX was AI, XAI, and all that. And so you're starting to see this across the board in that sector. I talked at length about it in my last podcast, so I'm not going to repeat it again a couple days later. So if you didn't watch the podcast I did earlier this week, go check that one out. And I went over all of the CapEx and the spending of these hyperscalers and why it's really unsustainable and the potential collapse that's coming. But just to look at the overall market, the Dow was down about 1.2% on the week, closed at 52,146. And the S&P down a little bit more because of the tech exposure, down 1.35%. Biggest loser on the week was the NASDAQ, down 2.2%. And the Russell 2000 only down 0.35%. So it held up the best of the major averages. You know, one of the stocks, too, that blew up today was Netflix. And it was down maybe about 7.5% on the day, something like that. But on the lows, it was down over 11%. Its earnings disappointed. Obviously, Americans are strapped, right? They can't afford to pay all the rising costs of all these streaming services. So Netflix was down about 8% on the week. So pretty much all the decline happening today. But Netflix is down 45% from its high, too, just like SpaceX. SpaceX got there a lot faster than Netflix. But, you know, Netflix was a high-flying momentum stock, and, you know, the momentum is gone. And, you know, there's a lot of air beneath that stock price, too. But gold, silver also down on the week. Gold down 1%. Gold spent a couple of days trading below 4,000, but it didn't close the week below 4,000. We closed at $4,017.30. It finished out the week with just over a $40 gain today. Silver fared much worse, down 4% on the week. Silver closed at $55.83, I believe. This is about the lowest weekly close I've seen in a while for silver. And the mining stocks did even worse, or about the same as silver. The GDX was down 3.9%, and the GDXJ down almost 5%, 4.8%. Once again, the markets have got this wrong. The markets are reacting to rising bond yields, to the Fed, and I'm going to go over part 2 of the Warsh testimony a little bit later in this podcast. But it's the idea that he's now this hawk that's going to be tough on inflation. But also it was the real escalation of the war. You know, the war really came back in focus this week, especially in oil prices. Oil prices closed up about 11.5% on the week, closed at around $82.50. We're now up 22% so far in July for oil prices. Remember, we were down 30% in June. We're already up 22% in July. So that also pushed down gold because, again, traders are assuming that war is bad for gold. Just because gold is lower now than it was when the war started, that's the new narrative, that war is bad for gold. No, it's not. It's always been good for gold. It always will be good for gold. The only reason that gold went down when this war started was because it went up so much before the war started. And part of that was due to the anticipation of the war. So this is a massive head fake that is creating an excellent opportunity for people who missed out on a huge rally to be buying both the metals and the miners. And yes, silver is way off its high of $1.25-ish, down to $55.83. But what I focus on is the fact that we're above 50. We had a massive breakout. You know, there was tremendous overhead resistance just under 50, going back to 1980, and then again in 2011. So the silver chart looks phenomenal. And I think in a couple of years, you'll barely notice the drop from 125 down to 55, where we are now. So it is a great opportunity to be buying. Bond yields did ease a bit on the week based on the better than expected inflation numbers. And I talked about the CPI on my last podcast, better than expected. The same thing happened with the PPI. That came out better than expected too. In fact, I got those numbers right here. Producer prices in June down 0.3% on the month, year over year, only up 5.5 versus the prior month up 6.5. And the core up 0.2, better than the expectation of up 0.4. And year over year, excluding food and energy, you have producer prices up 4.7%. And that's better than the 4.9%. So that's what, caused bond yields to move down a bit as the probability of a Fed rate hike went down a bit based on these numbers. But the yields are still very high relative to where we've been. The yield on the 10-year Treasury closed the week at 4.54 and the 30-year at 5.06. So these are still high yields relative to where we've been, not relative to where we're going. And where we've been, going back to the 90s or the 80s or the 70s, they're low compared to that. But in recent memory, post-2008 financial crisis, these yields are about the highest we've seen. And they're going to get a lot higher. Meanwhile, the news on inflation really isn't good. What drove the drop in producer prices, the same thing that drove the drop in consumer prices, it was a 30% decline in oil prices in June. Well, they're already up 22% in July. So why are we celebrating a big drop in oil prices that has already been largely reversed? And there's a good chance that it'll be completely reversed. But even more significant than that, look at the numbers that came out today on import-export prices. I've mentioned this many times on the podcast. These are much more honest numbers than the CPI or the PPI because there's no substitution. There's no hedonic adjustments. The numbers are the numbers. And year over year, import prices are up 7.1%. Export prices are up 10.2%. Compare that to the 3.5% increase year over year in the CPI, and a little bit hotter, as I just said, in the producer prices. These numbers are far more reflective of the price increases that Americans are actually paying. Obviously, if imports are up 7.1%, we buy a lot of imports, we're paying those higher prices. Maybe the CPI doesn't reflect it, but we're paying it. Now, you might say, well, we don't care about the export prices because we're not paying that, so it doesn't matter if they're up 10.2%. But most of what we export, we also consume ourselves. Let's say we export a lot of agricultural products, wheat, corn, soybeans. Well, we also eat wheat, corn, and soybeans. Pretty much everything we export, we also consume. And so if the price of what we're exporting is going way up, well, the price of what we're not exporting must be going up by the same amount because it's the same stuff. And this relates to the cost of producing stuff in America. So the cost of the stuff we make ourselves rose 10.2% year over year. The cost of the stuff that other people make for us that we buy and import only went up 7.1%. So that shows me that the inflation pressures inside the United States are even stronger than the inflation pressures outside the United States because the costs of the stuff we make here are rising faster than the cost of the stuff that's made abroad. But this shows you inflation is a much bigger problem than what the government claims. And that's why it's such a big concern. Right? That's why the public is so irate about inflation. That's why it is the number one economic problem. It's because the problem has gotten worse. Donald Trump promised that prices would be coming down on day one. And instead of going down, they've gone way up. And that's also why this is all they're talking about at these hearings. That's why Congress and the Senate are berating the Fed over what are you going to do about inflation? How are you going to stop inflation? Of course, I pointed out on the last podcast, they're helping to cause it. So they've got no right to criticize the inflation that they themselves had a hand in creating because inflation is a tax. It is the way government spending is funded. And they're the ones that are voting for the huge deficits that therefore necessitate inflation to fund them. But again, the reason the government wants to misdefine inflation, claim inflation as rising prices and not an expansion of the money supply, is precisely so they can pretend that they're not the cause. So they can try to blame whoever is raising the prices and not accept responsibility for the inflation they created that resulted in people having to raise prices. Anyway, I'm going to get right to that hearing. We'll take a quick break, so don't go anywhere. I'm coming right back. People assume skin health is about what you put on it, but my biomarkers actually changed how I think about my skin. Here's what nobody tells you. Your skin is the body's report card. Breakouts, dullness, slow healing, those aren't always surface problems. They're often signals from the inside. Vitamin D and zinc tell that story better than any mirror can. Low vitamin D, the regulatory hormone most people are quietly short on, and low zinc, which can surface as acne, slow healing, or dermatitis. That's why I use Function. 160 plus lab tests a year, including the markers underneath skin health that you'd never catch from the outside. Not guessing, just a clear read on what's actually going on. I use this and you should too. Check your health the way I do. Function provides 160 plus lab tests for $1 a day and member pricing on advanced imaging. Join at functionhealth.com/Peter and use code Peter25 for a $25 credit. All right, so actually before I get into what Kevin Warsh had to say to the U.S. Senate, I want to talk a little bit about what I heard our Secretary of the Treasury, Scott Bessent, say on Fox News. He was being interviewed by Jesse Waters, and he was taking him on a tour, I guess, of, and on the wall there were framed old Federal Reserve notes prior to 1968 or prior to 1933, where you had silver certificates and gold certificates, where it was legitimate currency, IOUs, redeemable on demand in gold or silver coins. And so Scott Bessent is walking down the hall, pointing this out to Jesse Waters and explaining to him, how our currency changed, how it used to be backed by gold and silver, and how now it's just fiat currency, right? Which is true. Of course, it's all unconstitutional. He didn't get into that. But the reason I'm bringing this up is he then told Jesse Waters that if any of these old notes still exist, right, the silver certificates or the gold certificates, he said, if you have one of these, you can bring it to Fort Knox and you can get your gold. You can get your silver. He actually believed that these silver certificates are still good. They're not. How could he not know that? Now, I guess I can forgive the average guy or gal on the street might not know that, right? That the government repudiated these notes years ago. It was Roosevelt, 1933. Roosevelt said, if you have a gold certificate, you can no longer get any gold. You can't get gold for your gold certificates. The silver certificates remained good until 1968. But after 1968, those were no good either. You could not get any redemption. So yes, maybe your typical guy, especially somebody who went to a government school, like what the hell do they learn? So they might not know anything about the monetary history of the United States or the Federal Reserve. But if there's anybody in the Trump cabinet that you would think would know this, it's the Secretary of the Treasury. I mean, he's the guy that actually signs the bills, right? He's supposed to know about the history of our money. And he thinks he does because he's explaining it to Jesse Waters as if he knows, yet he is completely wrong about something that's so obvious. I mean, I can't even remember when I originally learned this, but I've known it pretty much my entire adult life. I'm pretty sure when I was still in junior high school, I knew that you couldn't take these notes in for redemption. In fact, when Scott Bessent said if any of these things were around, there's lots of them. There are a lot of these certificates. I went on eBay and that, you could buy them on eBay, and I saw one set that was framed, right? So you could buy it with the frame, and it had 3 silver certificates, 2 $2 bills and a $1 bill. So that means that you could get 5 silver dollars back in the day, right? You could have gone to the government, handed them that, a $2 bill, and they would have given you 2 silver dollars. You either get, a Morgan silver dollar or a peace dollar, right? You got real silver. You could buy those 3 bills. They were selling them in the set. It was like $31, $31.95 or something like that. That includes the frame and everything. Now, according to Scott Bessent, you could take those $5 to Fort Knox, and they will hand you 5 silver dollars, which are worth about $60 a piece, $300 worth of silver. According to Scott Bessent, you could do that. I mean, it would be funny if somebody had that video, put it on their phone, went down to Fort Knox with some of these old certificates and said, hey, I'm here to get my silver. Scott Bessent said, I just have to bring them down and you'd give me my silver. Now, of course, a lot of people, when I pointed this out on X, people were saying, oh, come on, Peter, he didn't really say that. He really said that. That is exactly what he said. Go on my X feed. I reposted the clip. The person who posted it didn't even pick up on it. I reposted somebody else because in the same clip, he said that, hey, he's been down to Fort Knox and all the gold is there. So don't worry about it. It's all there. Well, I'm not going to believe anything he says. If he doesn't even realize that the gold certificates are no longer valid and you can't get redemption or in the silver certificates, why should I believe him on what's in Fort Knox? But the person who posted it just focused on that point. Hey, how do we believe this guy? But the minute I'm listening to it, I'm like, oh my God, how could the guy not understand something so simple? And then other people were saying, look, he slipped, he misspoke. No, he didn't. Listen to what he said. He was very clear. He believed that you could still get your gold and silver for these notes, that they were still good. Now, maybe he's confused by the fact that they're still legal tender. Yeah, I mean, if you've got an old $2 silver certificate, you can still spend it. It's still $2, but you're not going to get $120 worth of silver. And what that shows you is how much purchasing power the U.S. dollar has lost. Because in 1968, if you were dumb enough to keep the paper, then you still got $2. But if you converted it and got your silver dollar, you got, $60. The difference is the inflation. Right? The difference is how much money the government has created between 1968 and now to pay for the Great Society, the war on poverty, the Vietnam War, and everything that's happened since, right? 70s, 80s, all these expenditures. That's why the dollar buys so little, because the government robbed so much of the purchasing power. But anyway, so let me move forward to the Kevin Warsh testimony, day 2. This is the U.S. Senate, right? The day before he spoke at the House. And a lot of what he said was repetitious. So I'm not going to focus on a lot of what he said because I already discussed it on my Tuesday podcast. So again, if you haven't watched the Tuesday podcast, make sure and watch that because I went over a lot of this stuff. But there were a couple of new things that came up in the Senate. And of course, it started off with Elizabeth Warren and, really chastising him for all the things that Trump is doing, right? All the grifts, all the way he's making money. And in fact, he just announced yesterday his latest grift. And again, nobody in the Republican Party is criticizing Trump for this. But he uses his own social media, Truth Social, and he exclusively posts on Truth Social. And when he posts on Truth Social, a lot of times what he posts moves the market because his posts specifically relate war, peace, tariffs on, tariffs off, right? A lot of his posts, result in stocks going up or down, or oil going up, or crypto going up, right? What he's now doing, he just announced that if you want to pay extra, you can get those posts a little bit sooner than everybody else. What is the purpose of that? Why would you need a post 10 or 20 seconds before everybody else gets to see it? I'm not really sure the time lag, but it's something very small. Who would care? The only person who would care is a trader who's got like a program, an algorithm, where he can program Trump's Truth Social account directly into the algorithm to immediately trade based on those posts. So Donald Trump is saying, if you want basically what amounts to insider information, market moving information, I'll share it with you early if you pay me money. He's basically selling access to this information so you could trade off of it before anybody else gets it. How is there not outrage over what Trump is doing? Because it's actually an admission, too, that his posts can move the market, because that's the only added value. I mean, why else would you pay? Oh, these posts are so important, I need to pay extra to get them 10 seconds earlier or 20 seconds earlier. Who cares? Except if you get them 10 or 20 seconds earlier, you can position yourself in the markets before everybody else. Now, of course, if a lot of people end up buying the tweets early, or the posts rather, that's going to reduce their value, right? But pretty much everybody who's trading off of this is going to have to pay up, because if they don't pay up, they're going to be too late. So this is a massive grift. I mean, can you imagine, is this what all the presidents are going to do from now on? They're just going to post exclusively on a particular platform and then charge you money so that you could see the market moving posts that they're making. But so a lot of the criticism, that Warsh got was actually Trump criticism, right? They were trying to get Warsh to agree that Trump was a bad guy and he was doing us bad stuff. And of course, he's not going to do that, right? So they're just grandstanding. They're just talking, for a sound bite and for their own constituents. But there were a couple of interesting questions and answers. So one of them, and this was Senator Kennedy, and this was probably the best exchange. So Kennedy asked Walsh, what caused inflation? What caused it? He said, I want a quick answer. And Warsh responded, monetary policy caused it. Yes, perfect. He admitted that the inflation that we have was caused by monetary policy. Well, who was in charge of monetary policy? The Fed. So Warsh admitted that it was the Fed. It wasn't COVID. It wasn't Putin. It wasn't supply chains. He acknowledged that the Fed caused the inflation. Now, again, as I said on the last podcast, the Fed didn't cause it by itself. The Fed had a partner in crime, and that was the U.S. Congress and the president, right? Because it was fiscal policy that he monetized that caused the inflation. So Warsh is accepting the Fed's responsibility, yet Congress is not accepting theirs. But then Kennedy followed up, and it was a great follow-up. He said, okay, is inflation, the high inflation, going to be there permanently? And Warsh said, nope, not on my watch. And then Kennedy said, okay, what are you going to do about it? Perfect. What are you going to do about inflation? And then Walsh said, I got 3 things that I'm going to do about inflation. And then he listed the 3 things. Number 1, he's going to make sure that the markets know that the Fed is serious about bringing down inflation. Right? And so then Kennedy said, okay, so you're going to talk about it. Exactly. They're going to talk. They're going to say, you know what? We're serious about bringing down inflation. The second thing they're going to do was take ownership of the inflation, which he basically did. We own it. We created it. And then say that the Fed has the power to do something about it. In other words, more talk. They're going to own it, and they're going to talk about what they're going to do about it. So of the first 2 things that he's going to do, it's just talk about it. Now he gets to the third thing that he's going to do. He said, we're going to look at our tools. interest rates and the balance sheet and decide if we need to make any adjustments. So they're going to talk and they're going to look. How does that count as what they're going to do about it? I mean, doesn't he know what he's going to do about high inflation? If he understands that the Fed caused it and its money supply and artificially low interest rates, why doesn't he say, we're going to shrink the balance sheet? We're going to jack up interest rates, because that's the only thing he can do. Instead, he doesn't want to do any of that. He's just going to talk. He's going to look, right? That's why I said it's all bullshit. Meanwhile, look at money supply, M2, up 5.6% year over year. That is not a Fed that's fighting inflation. That is a Fed that is creating inflation. Now, we haven't got the money supply numbers yet under Warsh. We'll get that, I think, in another week or so. We'll get the first monthly, because they release these numbers every month. And we'll be able to see what happened under his watch. But we have been able to see the balance sheet. Right? The balance sheet is there, and it's been growing. In fact, the most recent week, the Fed's balance sheet rose another $7.4 billion. The balance sheet went from $6.736 trillion to $6.743 trillion. So the balance sheet went up. It's expanding. Why is he doing that? In fact, he admitted that he was uncomfortable with the balance sheet in its current size. And he said it's so big, to him, it looks more like fiscal policy, which it is. It was the Fed monetizing government debt. So he knows the Fed's balance sheet is too big, yet he continues to make it bigger. So he can talk, but he can't act. And again, if the markets are not figuring this out, it should be obvious. Because if Walsh did what he needed to do, the markets would be crashing if he did it. That's why he's doing it. That's why he set up all of these task force to study a problem where the solution is obvious. And, I mentioned on the last podcast that, the Fed has 23,000 employees, right? Whereas it had 40 when they first started in 2014. So the real inflation has been in the number of people that work for the Fed. But we went from 40 people to 23,000 people. Can't those 23,000 cover it? We really need 5 new task force. We really need to bring on even more people to try to figure out what to do about inflation when none of these 23,000 has any idea. We need more. And it's not rocket science. It's easy. And because it's easy, that's why they're setting up these task force, because they don't want to do it. That the problem, it's not knowing what to do. It's the fact that if you do it, you create such a big problem. That's why the Fed has always chosen to create inflation. And I mentioned, yes, Warsh says inflation is a choice. And he is going to choose inflation for the exact same reason that all of his predecessors chose inflation. Anyway, we got a second commercial break. I got a lot more to talk about, so stick around. We're coming right back. Quick question. Are you hiring in another country right now? Because once you do, things can get complicated fast. But that's where Pebble can help. You can send offers in minutes to anyone in the world and get them onboarded fast. I've dealt with this firsthand. Once you start working with contractors and employees in different countries, suddenly you're juggling local labor laws, contracts, payroll, compliance issues, tax questions, and you're stitching together 3 or 4 different tools just to stay organized. It eats up time and it introduces risk. That's where Pebble comes in. Pebble is an AI-powered global HR platform built for founders and operators who are hiring around the world. It lets you hire, pay, and manage talent in over 185 countries with onboarding that can be done in minutes. Instead of bouncing between separate systems for contracts, payroll, benefits, and compliance, Pebble brings everything together in one place. Built-in guidance and local expertise, so you don't have to become an HR lawyer just to expand your team internationally. The fastest growing companies are using Pebble to stay organized and reduce risk. Bottom line, it simplifies global people operations so you can focus on growing the business instead of worrying about paperwork. Their new standard discounted pricing at $399 per month per employee helps you contain costs. Go to highpebble.ai to get a free estimate. That's highpebl.ai for a free estimate. Now, there are also questions about AI, and I thought the most interesting one had to do with the AI bubble. And I don't remember which senator asked him this question, but he said, what happens if the companies that spent all this money, the hyperscalers, building out the data centers and AI, what happens if these investments never result in a profit? Which is exactly what I was talking about on my last podcast. So he asked Warsh, what would happen? What would be the consequences for the U.S. economy if it turns out that all this money was a waste? Maybe not necessarily a waste in that there's no use for it, but that the companies that spent all the money are not going to generate a profit. And therefore, they're going to have a hard time repaying their debt based on all the money they borrowed. And instead of saying, well, that's going to be a big problem, which it will be a big problem, he basically dismissed it by saying, well, I guess that could inhibit their ability to tap the capital markets. It may make it harder for them to borrow more money. What do you mean may and if? I mean, of course it will. It will be a huge problem if these investments turn out to have been malinvestments. If it turns out that from a corporate point of view, the money was basically thrown away. And now the companies don't really have the ability to repay this debt. So I think he downplayed. Now, he could have said, look, I don't think that's going to happen. These are smart companies. These investments are probably going to pay off. But that wasn't the question. The question wasn't, what do you think? Are these investments sound or not? It was in the event that it turns out that they can't make any money, that they overinvested and they're going to lose money, what kind of economic impact is that going to have? And he pretty much shrugged it off like it's no big deal. And I think it is a big deal. And that's one of the reasons that I am concerned about it. And of course, it means a lot of people are going to lose a lot of money in these stocks. You know, what is the impact going to be there? Because these are the stocks that dominate the markets. This is where most of Americans have their money. You know, Trump is, bragging about these Trump accounts. He talked about them again in the speech he gave last night about, voter fraud, talking about how rich Americans are going to be. All the kids are going to be rich because they're buying stocks. Well, they're probably buying these stocks that are going to collapse if it turns out that these hyperscalers wasted their money. But of course, Donald Trump talks about how rich our kids are going to be in 20 years because of these Trump accounts. No, they're going to be broke because of 20 years of deficit spending. The debt that they're going to inherit is going to vastly exceed whatever stock portfolios they own. But anyway, I don't want to even get into that topic. I don't have enough time. I got a bunch of things I want to talk about on this podcast. And by the way, one other thing I want to mention on AI, because I hear a lot of people, because the public is worried that AI is going to cost them their jobs. And yeah, a lot of people are going to lose their jobs, the jobs they have now, because of AI, right? I mean, people lose jobs. I mean, when the telephone came around, the telegraph operator lost his job on the telegraph. Now, maybe he got hired, as a telephone operator instead, right? Or the guy that was making, buggy whips, he lost his job, but maybe he got a job at an auto company, right? So, but there's always a transition. Jobs are lost and jobs are created. So people are always saying that, yes, jobs will be destroyed, but even more jobs will be created. So they're trying to say that on balance, that AI will create more jobs than it destroys. That's probably not true. It will destroy more jobs than it creates. And that is a good thing. That is progress. What AI will do is mean that human beings don't have to work as hard to get the things that we need because we'll have machines do the work for us. But what will happen is we'll have fewer, better jobs. See, some people won't need jobs at all, or they'll work less. They won't have to work as much. They'll be able to enjoy more leisure because of increased productivity. So we'll destroy jobs that we don't really need anymore, and we'll replace them with other jobs that the AI can't do. But those jobs will end up being higher paying. So the people who still want jobs or need jobs will be able to get better jobs. But the truth is that some people who don't want jobs at all, more people will have that option. the option not to work because of the increased productivity of everybody else who still works, and in particular, the increased productivity of computers and robots and all those things. So that's the idea behind automation and progress, is so machines work harder so humans can work less, right? They work more, we work less. So that is a good thing. And overall, that is what will end up being happening. But a couple of other things that I want to talk about that happened regarding, my battles with the government. So first of all, I had a FOIA request. I mentioned earlier about Truth Social. Well, one of the things that Trump used Truth Social for was to call me out as a jerk and a loser and a Trump hater. And this is back in December of 2025, because I went on Fox and Friends on Fox News, and I was critical of the president's economic policy, particularly inflation. And I said that prices are still rising. The inflation problem is not going away. And, I blamed, the big spending of Trump and the big, beautiful bill. And so I said, inflation is getting worse. That really pissed off Trump. And, it was like 5 a.m. when I did this interview. Now, I was in Dubai, so it was, late afternoon for me, early evening, I forget. But the president was up at the crack of dawn, right? And he's watching Fox News. And, before he even gets out of bed, he's on Truth Social talking about what a loser and idiot I am. And in this post, he claimed that I was totally wrong about prices, that they were actually falling substantially since he became president, which was, blatantly not true. And then he publicly berated the booker. He was like, who the hell booked this jerk? I mean, what's the problem with that guy? And obviously that scared the bejesus out of the booker, right? Because now the president of the United States is pissed off at you, right? You don't like that, right? And so anyway, I don't know, I forget, a couple of weeks later, I found out that this guy, Jonathan Kopich of the Federal Housing Finance Administration, sent an email to a company that stores clips of TV interviews. And then if you need a clip, you call the company up, Grabian company, good company, and you can get the clip. And so this guy, Jonathan Kopich, sends an email to Grabian, and he says, hey, I want a copy of the interview. And this is the email. It says, hi there. I saw the president post about Peter Schiff being interviewed on Fox and Friends Weekend this morning. Could I get that interview? ? Thanks, John. Now, I'm thinking, okay, I gotta do a FOIA request. I want to find out like what they discussed, what was said, because I have not been invited on Fox News since. So that was in December of last year. This is July. And not only have I not been invited on, in fact, that appearance on Fox and Friends, I was on it a week or two earlier. So they were making a habit of inviting me on. And not only have they not invited me on since this, but nobody will return my emails over there. The guy that booked me or none of the people, I mean, I've emailed them a few times. I can't even get a reply, right? So I became concerned. What did they do? They requested a copy of this interview. Then what? What kind of discussions? Why did they request a copy? What did they do after they requested a copy? So I do a FOIA request, and I specifically ask for all the emails from this guy or anybody else in the FH Housing Administration that mention me, that mention Peter Schiff or Fox News from the date December 6th, right, when this email was sent, till the date of the request, which was, in January sometime. And about 4 months later, I get a reply from the government that says, we searched all the records. There's no emails. There's no data. There's nothing that relates to you or Peter Schiff, right? Case is closed. We found nothing responsive to your request. I replied and I said, well, that's impossible because I know of at least one email because I saw it. So how could you have found nothing when I know there's at least one? can you go back and look, right? And there was another guy, this guy, Nicholas Jacobs, that was also copied on the Jonathan Kopich email, right? So two guys at the Federal Housing Finance Administration, are getting, and I said, you must have missed something. So just a couple of days ago, so it took another couple of months, they contact me and they say, okay, yep, here, we found an email that is responsive, and this is the only one there is, and that we consider the matter closed. So what they gave me was that exact email that I just read. So initially, they didn't even have this one. And then when I said, well, I know of one, the only thing they sent me was the one that I already had. Now, that's not even believable because obviously the company emailed them back. They must have. I don't know for sure because I haven't seen a copy of that one. But I can only imagine because that's their business, right? They provide these clips. And so I'm sure they got the clip. They didn't produce that email. But then what did they do? So they asked for the clip of my interview. And then that's it. They never discuss what I said. They never talk about it amongst themselves. Neither of these guys, there's no way to believe that. Obviously, they asked for this interview for a reason. And there must have been something. Now, what I think happened is that they contacted Fox News about this and they got me banned. Now, it's possible that Fox just decided, hey, Trump doesn't like Peter Schiff, right? He called him a jerk and a hater. Let's just not book him anymore because, we don't want to upset the president. Our audience loves the president. The president doesn't like Peter Schiff. Let's just not have Peter Schiff on. That's possible. But it's also possible because the Trump administration actively tried to get a copy of this following Trump's criticism. It's possible that they reached out and they said, hey, do us a favor. Don't let this guy on anymore. We don't like it. He's saying stuff that we don't like. We don't want the president's base that watches Fox News to hear this stuff. We don't want any negative talk about the economy. We don't want people saying that prices are rising, which in fact they were. We don't want people telling the truth when the president is telling all these lies, right? We especially, at Fox, because these are the people that need to believe the president's lies. So don't put somebody on like Peter Schiff. I was hoping that, I might find something like that would prove that. Of course, they probably either they destroyed all the evidence and so therefore it didn't exist, or they're just hiding it just like the IRS did. Remember, I had to sue the IRS to get them to comply with my FOIA request. So I would probably have to sue the FA or whatever, Housing Authority to get this information. Because, the government is a bunch of criminals, right? They do something illegal, and then they do something illegal again by covering it up. And I know there are a lot of people who are saying, Peter, I'm making a big deal about this. I'm being a crybaby. Look, I don't care. I don't really care if I'm not on Fox News again. I mean, I'd like to be on, but if I'm not on, I'm not on. It's the principle that bothers me. It's the fact that this is censorship. And, the most important part of free speech is freedom to speak critically of the government, right? Because normally the government doesn't care. If I want to speak critically of my neighbors or just somebody else, they don't give a damn, right? Where freedom of the press is important, where freedom of speech is important, is where you're free to criticize your government, because that's where the government can, stop you, right? An oppressive government will clamp down on your right to complain, to point out what they're doing. And this is what is happening if the president was involved. If they leaned on Fox News in any way to get them not to book me, that is a big, big problem. And especially since one of the things Trump ran on was, hey, let's freedom of the press or free speech, where all this political correctness and cancel culture, well, he's trying to cancel me, right? From speaking my mind, political speech, the most sacrosanct speech that needs protected. I went on Fox and spoke politics, and now I can't go on, I think. Now, maybe it's just a coincidence. Maybe they just haven't decided to invite me on. But they would, why didn't they respond to my emails? I've sent them multiple emails. They don't bounce back. The email addresses are still valid. I guess these guys are even afraid to answer me. Now, I have been on Fox Business since then. Just one show, the Claimant Countdown. So it's obviously not a complete ban all over all of Fox. But, I'm clearly not welcome on Fox and Friends, and maybe not the entire Fox network because nobody else has contacted me. And in fact, the only person who has contacted me on Fox Business since then has been, Liz Claimant. So to her credit, I'm still on, and I guess she hasn't had any pushback. But this is a big issue. But the even bigger issue that I've been fighting with FOIA is about my bank. And I just got some more explosive information. It's coming out in drips and drabs. And these are emails that were previously redacted. And when I sued the IRS, the judge agreed with me that the redactions were inappropriate, that the exceptions that the IRS gave for hiding this information from me did not apply. And the judge ordered the IRS to release the documents without the redactions so I can actually see what was written there. And so I got a new batch of documents a couple of days ago. And I got some more explosive evidence that I did not know about. And I posted it on my website, 9 Fraud. And, if you have never gone to 9 Fraud, this is where I'm putting all this stuff. And the reason it's 9 Fraud is because it's 9 in Australia, Channel 9, which is the network in Australia that ran the defamatory 60-minute piece. And they also, the company also owns The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald, and that's where this guy, Nick McKenzie, works, who basically did this defamatory story, this news story. So that's the name of it. But I have all this FOIA stuff up on there. So you got to go there after this podcast. Go to 9fraud.com and look at the exhibits. And the most recent one I just posted, it says latest FOIA evidence, the ATO, Nick McKenzie, and the manufactured success of Operation Atlantis. And I learned some interesting facts that I kind of suspected, but I didn't have as much evidence as I do now that this, in fact, was the case. So, first of all, the OSIF commissioner, there was an email from the OSIF commissioner about the rescheduling of the press conference to shut down the bank. And at that point, it was scheduled for June 20th. And they kicked it back to June 30th because they had a scheduling conflict with the head of criminal investigation, Jim Lee at the IRS. He couldn't get down to Puerto Rico for the press conference on the 20th. So they postponed the action to the 30th, which again shows you there was no emergency that was worthy of a cease and desist. They were more concerned about the optics of the press conference than protecting the bank's customers. But also in that email, Natalia Zakaria, who was the OSIF commissioner at the time, she said that they were going to issue this cease and desist. They were going to file it early that morning, but they were going to hold off on telling the bank until about an hour or so before the press conference because she wanted to make sure that I didn't have enough time to go to a judge to get an injunction to try to stop this from happening. So think about that. She's deliberately withholding something that she knows she's going to do. And she knows this is already weeks in advance. She knows that she's going to file it, but she doesn't want me to have enough time to react to it because in theory, I could have stopped it because there was no reason to put the bank into receivership because it wasn't insolvent. No customers were at risk. In fact, one of the other interesting things about the over 500 pages of emails that I've read is not a single email mentions the fact that the customers were at risk. There's no emails that say, oh, we got to do something to protect these customers. The bank is insolvent. No, There is no discussion at all. In fact, in an earlier email, not one of the ones I just got, but there was revealed to me a cost-benefit analysis that the Puerto Rican government did on closing down my bank. So the cost, the downside of closing my bank was the loss of jobs, right? They're going to shut down a bank. We're going to fire people. So they were worried that, yes, some Puerto Ricans are going to lose their jobs when my bank is forced out of business, right? So that was the negative. But what were the benefits? The benefits were all publicity, how it was going to look in the media, how it was going to look to their reputation, shutting down a bank accused of money laundering and tax evasion, how this would help Puerto Rico repair its reputation so it wouldn't be viewed as a tax haven, because here they were shutting down this bank that was accused of tax evasion, money laundering. But nothing in the cost-benefit analysis focused on actually stopping money laundering or tax evasion. No, that wasn't there, putting a stop to crimes. Or, again, there was nothing in there about protecting the customers. And in fact, not a single email, really, from anybody at the IRS or the ATO when they talked about the success of Operation Atlantis, the Atlantis investigation of my bank. It was always framed in media and publicity. How many articles were written about the Atlantis investigation and the shutdown of my bank? How many social media posts? And they basically, listed them all. How many reposts? How many likes? I mean, they were so obsessed with publicity and using the shutdown of my bank to lend credibility to the J5 and to the J5 tax chiefs themselves. This was like their crowning achievement, that they had shut down my bank, even though my bank did absolutely nothing wrong. And they knew that it did nothing wrong because there's nothing in these emails that even suggests that my bank did nothing wrong. And, but what I did find out that I really didn't know is that the real driving force behind the entire thing was not the IRS. It was the ATO, the Australian Tax Office. They were the motivators. They got everybody else going. They basically wrote the entire script that everybody else wrote. In fact, Jim Lee's opening remarks that he read were prepared and written for him in Australia by the ATO. So why was the Australian Tax Office the one that was so concerned with it? They're the ones that had the idea for the global press conference. They wanted it. And they were giving marching orders to everybody else with respect to how to promote it, what to say. Why? Nobody in Australia used my bank to evade taxes or launder money. Nobody. They accused, right? The 60 Minutes broadcast said that hundreds of Australians, multiple hundreds, were using my bank to evade taxes. When I sued for defamation, Nick McKenzie, 60 Minutes, Charlie Grieve, The Age, we asked them, show me one. Give us one guy, one gal who used Europe Pacific Bank for tax evasion in Australia. And they couldn't come up with one. So what is this big victory? If not a single tax cheat was caught, if not one extra dollar of money came into the ATO, what the hell was achieved here? Nothing was achieved. But what they achieved was publicity, and that's what they wanted. Read all the stuff they wrote. They craved this publicity. They said it's very important. But also, one of the most important aspects of it, they specifically said that it was important, that this global press conference was important to Nick McKenzie. They mentioned him by name more than once. We need to do this for Nick McKenzie because he has an interest in the story. Now, he didn't just have an interest in the story. He was a defendant in a defamation lawsuit where I sued him. And why did I sue him? I sued him because he accused the bank, or he accused me, of using my bank to facilitate tax evasion and money laundering, which was not true, and he had absolutely no evidence to prove that was true. I think what happened is he went to the ATO, his source, who likely leaked him the information in the first place. Because I also found out that this massive publicity campaign that happened in early January of 2020 on the day of action, right? They call it the day of action when everybody took action. That's the day that these two IRS agents came to my house and gave me a subpoena, right? And lied to me about who the target of the investigation was. But this was their day of action. But there was a big PR campaign around the day of action, but they never identified the target. They just said it was some bank in South America, which obviously it wasn't even my bank because I'm not in South America. But now that I found out that all the PR came from Australia, they probably don't know South America from the Caribbean, right down. They're nowhere near us, right? So they thought my bank was in Central America. They said Central America. But they had all this publicity around the day of action, but they didn't mention my bank. But they mentioned some target that they suspected there was this massive money laundering, tax evasion thing going on, and they're going to put a stop to it, right? This big day of action. Now, I think what happened is, 7, 8, 9 months into the grand jury investigation, when it became obvious that we did nothing wrong, right? There was a complete waste of time, right? They thought that the bank was facilitating tax evasion, money laundering, and it turned out that that wasn't the case, that we actually had very rigorous compliance, KYC, AML. So we probably had less tax evasion and money laundering going on at my bank than any place else, which is why not only was not a single employee of the bank charged with any crimes, but to my knowledge, not a single customer, not one customer out of the thousands and thousands of customers that we had, not a single one, to my knowledge, has been charged with anything, let alone convicted. Nobody. That shows you how tight the ship was that we were running. So I think what happened was when they found out that we didn't do anything wrong, yet they made a big deal about the day of action, they gave some information to Nick McKenzie so he could do a story about the bank and how the bank was guilty. They had no proof the bank was guilty, so they could do nothing legally, but they figured, you know what, let's get some publicity. Let's just get some newspapers or this reporters to come out and talk about this great investigation and how we've got this bank that's doing all this bad stuff. We can't prove it, but the media doesn't need any proof. They'll just allege it. They'll just say it. So Nick McKenzie, they do the 60 Minutes broadcast. They do the articles. They get the New York Times. They get Matt Goldstein in on it, probably to get extra credibility, is what I'm thinking. And they accuse me of tax evasion, money laundering. They really play up the J5. These guys are great. They're super cops. They're on the job. They busted this bank. They're putting a stop to tax evasion, money laundering, right? What they didn't count on is I file a defamation lawsuit. And then nothing happens to the bank. Nothing happens because the story is false. They're going to lose the defamation lawsuit. So I think Nick McKenzie goes to the ATO, goes to his contact and say, hey, you got to help me out here. I mean, I'm stuck. I ran your story. We said the guy was guilty and nothing has happened. Something needs to happen to this bank. You got to do something. I need some evidence to defend against this defamation lawsuit because otherwise I'm going to lose. You got to do something to prove that I was right. And I think what happened was the ATO reached out to the IRS and pressed them to do something. Now, they obviously didn't say, we need to do this to help Nick McKenzie defend himself against a defamation lawsuit. They probably said, we just want it for the publicity. We want some finality here. In fact, on many occasions in the emails, they talk about, phase 2, the debanking of Euro Pacific Bank, that it's important that we have this debanking. Of course, this is months before it actually got debanked. But it was, they said they wanted to have some concrete results. They wanted something tangible and real to show for Operation Atlantis. But Operation Atlantis was a complete failure. They had nothing concrete to show. And so they needed to get OSIF to shut down the bank. Now, one of the things I also found out in this new batch was that the IRS originally reached out to OSIF about the bank in January of 2021. Now, I had thought that the earliest they spoke was in December of 2021. It actually was January. I didn't know that until just the other day. But the earliest emails I've seen so far are from April of 2022. And that's because the only FOIA request that they've so far complied with is the one that specifically dealt with the press conference. So clearly, they didn't start planning that press conference until April. And that's why my email production started in April. But obviously, before they planned the press conference, they had to shut down the bank. I haven't seen any of those emails yet, but I'm going to get them because the judge ordered the IRS to produce them because I had two FOIA requests. One was almost completely redacted, and I got the judge to order the government to remove the redaction so I can actually read what was produced. That's the 500 and some odd pages I got. But my second request asked for all the records that mention me, Euro Pacific Bank, Operation Atlantis, going back to the day that they first started, right? The day of action in January of 2020. They didn't give me any of those records. The government claimed, well, that's too broad. We can't figure out what you mean. We're going to give you nothing. When I sued, the judge said, oh, that's bullshit. It's obvious what he wants. Give it to him. So I'm going to get all this. But basically, what it really means is that had I never filed my defamation lawsuit, had I just left well enough alone, the bank never would have been shut down. I would have been able to sell it because the only reason the ATO pressured the IRS to get OSIF to do something was to help Nick McKenzie defend against my defamation lawsuit. Because I think absent that, they would have left well enough alone, right? They got the 60 Minutes broadcast. It was already out there. They already talked about how great the J5 was and all this stuff. And, you know, that was out there. They got all that publicity. They didn't really need the finality. And in fact, the IRS didn't need it. The British didn't need it. The Canadians didn't need it. It was all Canada. Canada was the only country of the J5 that was really not only pressing for it, but leading the charge, scripting the entire narrative. Why was that? Because that's where Nick McKenzie was. So it wasn't just publicity for the ATO, for the IRS. The bank was shut down to bail Nick McKenzie and 60 Minutes out of the defamation lawsuit. Because the problem, 60 Minutes, they introduced the action against the bank as their only evidence. That was supposedly the proof that my defamation lawsuit was wrong because they said, look, the bank was shut down. It was guilty of tax evasion. It was guilty of money laundering. Schiff is a criminal. We were right. He was the mastermind behind the whole thing. But the problem was the judge actually looked at what was said, the specific reason given for shutting down the bank, which of course was a pretext, but that was solvency. It was internal controls. And in fact, the OSIF commissioner said at the very press conference that they tried to use as evidence, the OSIF commissioner said that no evidence of money laundering or tax evasion was found, that the bank was being shut down specifically for not having enough capital. And of course, the irony was the reason the bank didn't have enough capital is because it lost so much money as a result of the bad publicity generated by 60 Minutes, Australia, The Age, the New York Times. It was the leak of the information falsely accusing the bank of committing crimes that the bank was ultimately exonerated of committing that caused the very financial problem that resulted in the bank supposedly getting shut down. The media, which enabled the J5, the ATO, to claim credit. They said, look, this bad bank was shut down. Yes, it was shut down because you destroyed its reputation with a bunch of false allegations that you could not prove. If there was any evidence that the bank did anything wrong, somebody would have been charged. But nobody was charged with anything. Nobody even talked about what the bank did wrong. In fact, one of the other things that I found out in the most recent production. Jim Lee, that was written by the ATO on the morning of the press conference. He had no idea what the bank did. He sent an email to the publicity guy at the IRS and said, okay, hey, what exactly did this bank do wrong? Give me a couple of examples of how they helped the customers launder money and evade taxes. And the answer is still redacted. So I'm pressing the IRS to release the answer, but it was very short, like a paragraph. He also asked about 6 or 7 other questions, but the IRS agent said, it's better if we discuss this over the phone. Why did he want to discuss it over the phone? Because he didn't want to put in writing that the bank did nothing wrong, that there was absolutely no evidence, let alone they couldn't come up with one example, let alone 2, that the whole thing was a charade. It was a farce. It was a PR event, that the bank was being framed. I guess he didn't want to put that in writing. So he told Jim Lee, hey, I'll talk to you about it, right? And so I got all this new information. I'm going to get more. Again, go to 9fraud.com and check this out. And by the way, I apologize. This last bit of the podcast is all broken up because I ran out of memory on my computer. And so it's screwing the whole thing up. I have to keep starting and stopping it. So I got to figure out, what's wrong here so I can, erase some files so I can do this next time. But anyway, if you like the video, make sure to give it a thumbs up. Comment on it. If you're not watching on YouTube, go to YouTube, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Have a great weekend, everybody. I'll be back again next week with more podcasts on the Peter Schiff Show podcast. So bye for now.